It's been screamingly obvious since the very start of this pandemic that by far the most vulnerable people in our community would be those in aged care. In the past 24 hours, there have been another 25 corona deaths in Victoria, as I've said, a record, and most of them are associated with aged care. Of Victoria's 334 deaths so far, 197 are in aged care. Now, just as the Ruby Princess fiasco was a wake-up call to smarten up our border controls and traveller quarantine arrangements, the March-April COVID outbreaks at 2 New South Wales nursing homes should have been a wake-up call for Australia's aged care sector. 6 residents died at Sydney's Dorothy Henderson Lodge and 19 at Newmarch House. At Henderson Lodge, 80% of victims were sent to hospital, not so at Newmarch, where most were treated on site. So 6 dead at Henderson Lodge versus 19 at Newmarch. A key lesson, wasn't it, to send the sick to hospital? I think it's a lesson Victoria has ignored. After numerous reports of Victorian hospitals refusing to admit COVID cases from nursing homes, you'll recall I first raised this whole issue about 3 weeks ago with Federal Aged Care Minister Richard Colbeck. The Victorian State Government has only lifted its game following heavy pressure from Canberra. I can't fathom how it got to this that the Federal Health Minister Greg Hunt has had to demand that all people requiring clinical care, however old and however sick they may be, are actually transferred to hospital. But it has. Now, I'm conscious that there are many nursing home residents with care plans specifying no heroic interventions to keep them alive. And yet, especially the very old and very sick, sometimes treatment in place or in their aged care home rather than hospital might well be the best clinical option. But very few aged care facilities have the space or the expertise to set up proper isolation wards. That's why for nursing home residents, any general policy of treating COVID cases in aged care facilities was not much more than systematic euthanasia. Given that all the lockdowns and the consequent economic carnage over the past 6 months have all been justified in terms of protecting the most vulnerable, it's extraordinary that there's been so little understanding of how we do this. This idea that you can just ring fence around aged care homes and let the virus run rampant in the community is nonsense. Victoria shows you that if you have widespread community transmission, unless you're going to require all aged care workers to live 24/7 in the facilities that they work in, community transmission means it will get into aged care homes. Therefore, the best way to protect the elderly is to protect everyone from community transmission. The states in Victoria that have done this, prevented community transmission, well, they've protected their elderly. And those that haven't, meaning Victoria, well, they've seen, as we've seen again today, a significant loss of life. Much of the practical analysis here has been lost in the politicking, played out each day in the Victorian Premier's press conferences. Home last week, I watched every one of them carefully, and his very deliberate push to try and make the aged care crisis in his state of Victoria the fault of the federal government was obvious. Again, what's happening in Victoria is not happening anywhere else. So I went back and looked again at the documentation. Since the first issue of a COVID-19 fact sheet on aged care back on the 31st of January, the Federal Department of Health, on its own account, reports it has taken 53 separate measures specifically targeted to aged care. Of the federal government's 53 individual precautionary measures in aged care, fewer than 7 were official communications from the Chief Medical Officer, the Minister and others, reminding aged care providers of their responsibilities. To try and assert that there was no plan couldn't be further from the truth. But the problem always was, and is, if this virus gets a hold of the community, the first to die will be the most vulnerable, which is why preventing community transmission was and remains so critical. Given the Victorian government's hotel quarantine debacle that let this virus loose in the community, compounded by the crisis in testing and tracing, this is where the responsibility lands squarely on the Premier's feet, regardless of his spin. Right now it looks like stage 4 lockdowns are having an impact on the daily case rate in Victoria, and that's a good thing. Let's hope it continues, because it's our best chance of getting lives and businesses back to normal. But given this mess is a calamity of Victoria's own making on every level, don't fall for the Premier's deliberate and clever media strategy to try and now get praise for his lockdown plan working. Because if he didn't stuff up so badly in the first place, well, we wouldn't need this lockdown at all.